Hello everyone and welcome back. I absolutely love parallel storytelling or parallel narratives because it's the one thing that allows you multiple angles into a story. So you can see the same story from so many different perspectives, in so many different emotional contexts as well, and it just opens up your emotional horizons as well as your creative perspective on so many different levels. It's an absolutely wonderful concept. There are some great stories out there that deal with parallel universes or parallel storytelling. I think the Harry Potter universe is probably one of the most well-known nowadays, but there are lots of these stories. I thought I would begin this video by actually reading you a short story because there are way too few stories on this storytelling channel. So I think it was about time, and I've picked one from an author who was a master in parallel storytelling, and it might not be one you've heard of. So I wanted to pick one that was maybe a little bit unknown, but at the same time really shows what parallel storytelling can do. It's a story from a Swedish author called Selma Lagerlöf, and she was actually the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. She was also a school teacher at a high school for girls in Sweden, and she wrote, she wrote many different stories, but one of her publications was a book with short stories called Christ Legends, and they are sort of parallel short stories to the birth of Christ. We all know that story, you know, the manger and the three wise men and the star over Bethlehem and all of that. And it's an incredibly brave thing, I think, to do, to write parallel stories to a story that is not just so well known. It exists in, I think, every single corner of the world, this story, in you know, with variations, but still. And also a story that carries a lot of emotional context, because whether you are religious or not, we all have a sense of ownership. We all feel some sense of, I know this story from a particular context, and therefore it can be very dangerous to meddle with that or to try and change that. But she's doing it in such an elegant, emotional way. And she was a Christian person herself, and it very much shows. But her storytelling and her way of going about this, I think, is just amazing. So I wanted to tell you or read out to you one of these little short stories from her publication Christ Legends, and it's called The Holy Night. The Holy Night. When I was 5 years old, I had such a great sorrow. I hardly know if I've had a greater since. It was then my grandmother died. Up to that time, she used to sit every day on the corner sofa in her room and tell stories. I remember that grandmother told story after story from morning till night, and that we children sat beside her quite still and listened. It was a glorious life. No other children had such happy times as we did. It isn't much that I recollect about my grandmother. I remember that she had very beautiful snow-white hair and stooped when she walked, and that she always sat and knitted a stocking. And I even remember that when she had finished a story, she used to lay her hand on my head and say, "All this is as true as that I see you and you see me." I also remember that she could sing songs, but this she did not do every day. One of the songs was about a knight and a sea troll and had this refrain: "It blows cold, cold weather at sea." Then I remember a little prayer she taught me and a verse of a hymn. Of all the stories she told me, I have but a dim and imperfect recollection. Only one of them do I remember so well that I should be able to repeat it. It is a little story about Jesus' birth. Well, this is nearly all that I can recall about my grandmother, except the thing which I remember best, and that is the great loneliness when she was gone. I remember the morning when the corner sofa stood empty and when it was impossible to understand how the days would ever come to an end. That I remember, that I shall never forget. And I recollect that we children were brought forward to kiss the hand of the dead, and that we were afraid to do it. But then someone said to us that it would be the last time we would thank grandmother for all the pleasure she had given us. And I remember how the stories and songs were driven from the homestead, shut up in a long black casket, and how they never came back again. I remember that something was gone from our lives. It seemed as if the door to a whole beautiful, enchanted world, where before we had been free to go in and out, had been closed. And now there was no one who knew how to open that door. And I remember that, little by little, we children learned to play with dolls and toys and to live like other children. And then it seemed as though we no longer missed our grandmother or remembered her. But even today, after 40 years, as I sit here and gather together the legends about Christ, which I heard out there in the Orient, there awakes within me the little legend of Jesus' birth that my grandmother used to tell, and I feel impelled to tell it once again and to let it also be included in my collection. It was a Christmas day, and all the folks had driven to church except grandmother and I. I believe we were all alone in the house. We had not been permitted to go along because one of us was too old and the other was too young. And we were sad, both of us, because we had not been taken to early mass to hear the singing and to see the Christmas candles. But as we sat there in our loneliness, grandmother began to tell a story. There was a man, she said, who went out in the dark night to borrow live coals to kindle a fire. He went from hut to hut and knocked. "Dear friends, help me," he said. "My wife has just given birth to a child, and I must make a fire to warm her and the little one." But it was way in the night, and all the people were asleep. No one replied. The man walked and walked. At last he saw a gleam of a fire a long way off. Then he went in that direction and saw that the fire was burning in the open. A lot of sheep were sleeping around the fire, and an old shepherd sat and watched over the flock. When the man who wanted to borrow fire came up to the sheep, he saw that 3 big dogs lay asleep at the shepherd's feet. All 3 awoke when the man approached and opened their great jaws, as though they wanted to bark, but no sound was heard. The man noticed that the hair on their backs stood up and that their sharp white teeth glistened in the firelight. They dashed toward him. He felt that one of them bit at his leg and one at his hand, and that one clung to his throat. But their jaws and teeth wouldn't obey them, and the man didn't suffer the least harm. Now the man wished to go farther to get what he needed. The sheep lay back to back and so close to one another that he couldn't pass them. Then the man stepped upon their backs and walked over them and up to the fire. And not one of the animals woke or moved. Thus far, grandmother had been allowed to narrate without interruption, but at that point I couldn't help breaking in. "Why didn't they do it, Grandma?" I asked. "That you shall hear in a moment," said grandmother, and went on with her story. When the man had almost reached the fire, the shepherd looked up. He was a surly old man who was unfriendly and harsh toward human beings. And when he saw the strange man coming, he seized the long spiked staff which he always held in his hand when he tended his flock and threw it at him. The staff came right toward the man, but before it reached him, it turned off to one side and whisked past him far out in the meadow. When Grandmother had got this far, I interrupted her again. "Grandma, why wouldn't the stick hurt the man?" Grandmother did not bother about answering me, but continued her story. Now the man came up to the shepherd and said to him, "Good man, help me, and lend me a little fire. My wife has just given birth to a child, and I must make a fire to warm her and the little one." The shepherd would rather have said no, but when he pondered that the dogs couldn't hurt the man, and the sheep had not run from him, and that the staff had not wished to strike him, he was a little afraid, and dared not deny the man what he wished. "Take as much as you need," he said to the man. But then the fire was nearly burned out. There were no logs or branches left, only a big heap of live coals, and the stranger had neither spade nor shovel wherein he could carry the red-hot coals. When the shepherd saw this, he said again, "Take as much as you need." And he was glad that the man wouldn't be able to take away any coals. But the man stooped and picked coals from the ashes with his bare hands and laid them in his mantle. And he didn't burn his hands when he touched them, nor did the coals scorch his mantle, but he carried them away as if they had been nuts or apples. But here the storyteller was interrupted for the third time. "Grandma, why wouldn't the coals burn the man?" "That you shall hear," said Grandmother, and went on. And when the shepherd, who was such a cruel and hard-hearted man, saw all this, he began to wonder to himself, "What kind of night is this, when the dogs do not bite, the sheep are not scared, the staff does not kill, or the fire scorch?" He called the stranger back and said to him, "What kind of night is this, and how does it happen that all things show you compassion?" Then the man said, "I cannot tell you if you yourself do not see it." And he wished to go away, that he might soon make a fire and warm his wife and child. But the shepherd did not wish to lose sight of the man before he had found out what all this might portend. He got up and followed the man till he came to the place where he lived. Then the shepherd saw that the man didn't have so much as a hut to dwell in, but that his wife and babe were lying in a mountain grotto where there were nothing except the cold and naked stone walls. But the shepherd thought that perhaps the poor innocent child might freeze to death there in the grotto, and although he was a hard man, he was touched and thought he would like to help it. He loosened his knapsack from his shoulder, took from it a soft white sheep skin, gave it to the strange man, and said that he should let the child sleep on it. But just as soon as he showed that he too could be merciful, his eyes were opened, and he saw what he had not been able to see before, and heard what he could not have heard before. He saw that all around him stood a ring of little silver-winged angels, and each held a stringed instrument, and all sang in loud tones that tonight the Saviour was born, who should redeem the world from its sins. Then he understood how all things were so happy that night that they didn't want to do anything wrong. And it was not only around the shepherd that there were angels, but he saw them everywhere. They sat inside the grotto, they sat outside on the mountain, they flew under the heavens. They came marching in great companies, and as they passed, they paused and cast a glance at the child. There was such jubilation and such gladness and songs and play. And all this he saw in the dark night, whereas before he could not have made out anything. He was so happy because his eyes had been opened that he fell upon his knees and thanked God. Here Grandmother sighed and said, "What that shepherd saw we might also see, for the angels fly down from heaven every Christmas Eve if we could only see them." Then Grandmother laid her hand on my head and said, "You must remember this, for it is as true as that I see you and you see me. It is not revealed by the light of lamps or candles, and it does not depend upon sun and moon. But that which is needful is, that we have such eyes as can see God's glory. So that was a lovely little story from Selma Lagerlöf there, from her Christ Legends, and it's one of those stories that I remember my mum reading out loud to me in a Danish translation when I was a child. And it just puts a different perspective on a very well-known story. And that's one of the powers of parallel storytelling or parallel narratives. So let's just have a look at what it actually is and what it can do in interpretation. So first of all, parallel storytelling is based in oral storytelling tradition. And it has lots of elements from folklore and mythology and also religions, as we saw an example of here. In films and literature, it often presents a parallel plot or narrative to a main story. So it can present two or more alternative viewpoints as the same story is viewed from different perspectives. And the different story trails can create different outcomes or endings, as well as different emotional outcomes for readers and listeners. And this is really where the true power of parallel storytelling lies, because it's so easy to see a story from a black and white perspective. You have the good guys and the bad guys, for example. But the moment you start to see things from different perspectives, that's when you really start to touch upon the deep stuff here and what actually matters, and have a great opportunity of broadening horizons and levels of knowledge. The creative story value lies within that play that goes on with the parallels and the alternative views. Parallel storytelling can also create a much stronger inclusion for different participants, users and listeners through a shared collective imagination. So there will almost always be things that listeners or participants, visitors, can relate to the more perspectives or angles you present. So if you cannot relate to one particular way of telling a story, the chance is you can relate to other perspectives of the same story. So the more perspectives, the more angles you present to a story, the better the chances are for you to actually include more people. You can use parallel storytelling in so many different ways. That's such a great thing about it, and I think the greatest thing about it. You can play with different viewpoints and emotional contexts in a personal narrative, in your exhibitions, in guided tours, in historical games, whatever you put up, historical events, reconstructions, all of that. It's such a powerful tool to use. It presents multiple options and motivation and reasoning behind them. So that's a fantastic way of using it as well. For example, in political discussions, religious discussions, conflict-related interpretation, we've all been there, where we, behind the scenes as museum professionals, we discuss how do we actually present this rather heated debate. We've all been there, I think. And using parallel storytelling, it's such a fantastic way of doing that. Just seeing things from different perspectives, present that in a personal way is often a fantastic way of shedding lights on something that might be a little bit tricky. You can also help visitors see a story, event, situation from different perspectives. It will encourage a broader historic understanding of events and people, simply because you are capable of opening different emotional contexts as well. You can use historic characters in, for example, dramatized tours or live interpretation to present very subjective sometimes, but insightful and inclusive historic interpretation. So you can include historical facts and sources, but let a historical character present them in their own subjective way. And visitors will get that this is a subjective perspective because they have a historical character who is telling them about something from their very subjective perspective, obviously. You can also play with historic knowledge and sources and facts and references in different ways through parallel narratives. So just because you have a historical source that tell you one thing about a certain event or something, a historical event, for example, that doesn't mean that you have to present it exactly as that source describe the event or describe the character or describe whatever it's described, the situation. but you can actually present different perspectives to the same historical source. And that is an incredibly powerful way, because we all know history is biased. We all know there's no such thing as objective history telling or history information. And the moment you start, I think, realizing that in your interpretation as well, it becomes very powerful. It also gives visitors a new sense and a new perspective on history, that it isn't actually that black and white. It isn't actually that straightforward. There are many different things that play in when we look at historical sources. They are not just the truth. They are not just, they might be facts as they were seen from the person who wrote them down, but they might not be, you know, the ultimate sort of perspective of what happened, the holistic perspective of what actually happened in a situation, in a battle, in a historical context. And I think the more we can actually let that shine through in our interpretation as well, the more nuanced a picture we're capable of providing to our visitors as well, and also let them in on, let them be part of the discussion. I think there's so many good reasons for loving parallel storytelling and parallel narratives. It's obviously something that you have to be very aware of when you're playing with it in your interpretation, in your exhibitions and so on, because obviously it's possible to take it too far, but that can be said about many things. But it's a fantastic way into presenting sometimes complex historical discussions or debates as well. I would so love to hear about some of your examples. Have you seen any really good examples of parallel storytelling? What worked, what didn't work, what made it good, what made it what did it do for you? Did it open your eyes in a different way, perhaps to what you have normally thought of history? Did it do something in terms of the narrative, the way it was presented and so on? Please share your thoughts.